Greetings all. Can you hear me? Thumbs up. Okay. Welcome back. It's always encouraging when the students return. Welcome to week 2 Zoom session for EDL 700, the PLC class. You can now find the learning task responses from all of your work last, the collective intelligence treasure chest, from all of your responses to the learning task in week 1, in the week 2 learning enhancement section. And, as my practice this evening, someone please hit your mute on your microphone. Thank you. Sounds like my home used to. As is my practice, I've got a few thoughts and comments for the beginning of the session this evening, and then I'll open the floor for questions or comments on your part. And if you'd like to put the questions in the chat box, you can find that. And I'll try to make sure I address all those. Don't ever let me dodge your questions, please. A comment or two about the grades and the feedback. I've got 3 classes running this session. I've got your class and then data, using data class. Some of you are in both of those, and then I'm also supervising a pretty good chunk of interns. So I'm doing my best to try to grade pretty punctually. I really like to give feedback with every grade, and for those of you that have not discovered it, you can see my comments. When I do give you feedback, and when I post a grade and give you feedback, it shows up in the Moodle gradebook for you. Unfortunately, I can't give everybody feedback on every assignment, but I'll try to give feedback to you. And as you can probably tell, those of you that have gotten feedback, I love it when you make my brain run off in a different direction. That's encouraging and fun for me. And also, I'm fairly lenient with you on the APA citation, in the first week or so. But if I've been saying to you, your APA citation is not quite right, that's my way of saying, please get it right the next time. So if you would do that, it'd be very helpful and less painful for you as we go through the term. Also, on a similar topic, on the learning task where I ask you to cite a sentence specifically from the document or the presentation or the video, and show us the location in that document, either the page number or the slide number if it's from a slide deck, or the time marker if it's a video or a podcast. Please remember to do that when you post those citations. I noticed that in Learning Task 1.1, there were varied responses. A lot of you made connections to your classmates to the ELC, made by your classmates to the ELCC standards. I've mentioned this to you before, but I'm going to keep you trying to bring you back to those standards, because whenever you sit for your credentialing exams, whatever state that happens to be in, or country, as the case may be, those are always tied to the standards. And what I'm trying to do is make the language of the standards, and regardless of where you look at standards, they're pretty similar. But I'm trying to get you to think in terms of that language and write in terms of that language. I think it'll help you when you get ready to take the test, at whatever point that happens. Let's talk about PLCs in general for a second or two. The words of PLC, professional learning community. And the first word, professional, is there on purpose. One of the things in your comments, both in your responses and also the chatter I see on the discussion forum, I would encourage you not to think in terms of just being a member of a PLC. And my feedback to some of you too, and I'll just say this to all of you in the class right now, I'm going to consistently and persistently and not relentlessly try to get you to think from the perspective of a school leader. I know most of you are still in the classroom in one form or another. Most of you, a few of you have already garnered a leadership kind of role. But I'm going to constantly try to pull you to think from behind the eyes of a school leader, to listen with the ears of a school leader, to think about what kinds of responses and reactions that you would make if you were the person responsible for those professional learning communities or that school district or that campus. Because it's a professional, or they are professional learning communities, your perspective as you go through this program and me dragging you through the stuff that I drag you through, I'm trying to get you to continually reframe your thinking. Most of you have spent most of your careers, and some of you, we have one or two first-year teachers, and then we've got some with a little age on you, like myself, that have been doing it for 20, 30 years. But your role as you move from primarily that of being a classroom teacher towards school leadership is the role is shifting for you to from one of being primarily a teacher of children to primarily a teacher of adults. Now, the best practices and instructions still hold, but the language you use and the way you engage with your audiences is important. And you have to take into account the fact that you're talking to a bunch of adults now. You're working with a bunch of adults now. The truly good schools have always been professional learning communities. It's only been in the last about 15 to 20 years, probably 15 years, that we've adopted the nomenclature of professional PLCs, if you want to call them that. But the features of the PLCs have always been there in good schools. And the leadership moves that you and I make to foster that really haven't changed that much over time. The technology actually has made it a little easier to do that. And for those of you in the data class, our ability to collect real-time data and turn it around pretty quickly, it really gives us a powerful tool to help try to intervene for children and learners, regardless of their age, in a much more timely fashion than we used to do it. Something I want you to think about in terms of the PLCs, and I'm going to steal a little bit of the lexicon of Dr. Christensen from his video on how will you measure your life. He uses the word nested. And I want you to think in terms of your PLCs being nested too. As a school leader, you're not going to be just a member of one PLC. You're going to be a member of numerous PLCs, and in fact, you'll probably find yourself viewed as the leader of many of those PLCs, whether formally or informally. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was the principal of a large urban high school, I had in one of those high schools, I had 9 assistant principals, and every week we met for 1 hour and did nothing but a book study, and I refused to let anything enter into those discussions but what that book was doing for each one of us to improve our leadership skills and help us be better at our job. And we did not discuss parties or buses or textbooks or any of those things. I refused to let those enter into that particular conversation. But that was a PLC. It was the administrative team on that campus. On that very same campus, we had what most of you would recognize as the leadership team, which was administrators plus counselors plus department chairs. If it was a middle school or high school, you would include probably the athletic coordinator and the fine arts coordinator, and probably the student services director, those kinds of people that are playing the pivotal roles, but you've got that assembly of people that can be viewed and thought of as a professional learning community. It's basically a subset of the larger professional learning community. Most of you are probably thinking in terms of PLCs as being your grade level team or your departmental team. But again, I want you to think from this perspective of the leadership of a campus or or even a whole school district, for those of you that end up being superintendents, and some of you will. On that same campus, to extend my example for you, so I had the administrative PLC, I had the leadership team PLC. Also, I met monthly with the clerical and support staff. We were in a constant book study. Most of the time, those books were around either personal improvement or customer service. That was a PLC, a subset PLC, if you will, but that was one that I engaged in with those people. I didn't mention with our leadership team, I was frequently in book studies with them, or we were looking at campus data. Also, on that very same campus, we had the student services team, and that team actually was the assistant principals and the counselors, and then we brought in the LSSP, the psychology team, on that, and we also brought in the school resource officers. And my purpose on that was for us to, on that particular PLC, was for us to have regular conversations for those students that we were dealing with that had particular behavioral problems that were complicating their ability to learn, and quite often complicated the ability of other students around them to learn. But I found that us having a regular PLC, if you want to call it that, a discussion, and where we were discussing and thinking about and talking about those youngsters that had behavioral problems, it was very enlightening for us, because if we were, for instance, discussing little naughty Nelson, it was interesting a lot of times that the counselor that was working with Nelson would have a piece of the puzzle that the assistant principal didn't have. And the assistant principal might have a piece of the puzzle regarding naughty Nelson that the SRO did not know about. And so we began trying to connect the dots with these children to see if we couldn't intervene for them in a more meaningful and holistic way to help them become successful in the school setting. Another comment, I'm going to leave that conversation, but my point is this: don't think of yourself as being a member of only one PLC. And while I'm on that topic too, you're probably you need to be a member of a professional organization. If you're going to be a principal, then in whatever state you live in, seek out and find the principal organization that's most highly aligned to the campus level or your interest level that you work in, and become a part of that, and you'll become part of a professional learning community within those professional organizations as well. And that's a great network of people that you will begin to learn with and from in the process, and quite frequently that'll be your network of people that will help you when you're trying to deal with some particularly sticky and complex problems. Remember also that the PLC, again, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again, and I'll probably say it again to you in future weeks. The PLCs are something that we are. It's not something that we do. It's a state of mind. It's a state of being. Rather than an act. And some of you, I've seen this in some of your learning task responses, and also in some of your conversations in the discussion forum. Some of you seem to have a pretty good grasp of this concept, that it's a process, it's not an event. Okay, let me move on here. And I noticed too, Jasmine made the commented during, I think it was one of the discussion forums, about the issue of PLCs becoming fillers, and there was a little bit of chatter in there about that, and how it had when the PLC is viewed as a filler or as a checkoff box, as something you have to do, then it takes on a denigrating effect, not only on morale and performance, but on the team's performance as well. And that's true. The worst thing that you and I can do, the absolute, I believe, no, not the, one of the worst things that you and I can do as school leaders, and I'm guilty of it, but one of the worst things that you and I can do as school leaders and servant leaders is to dishonor the time of the people that work with us. So I would encourage you to constantly be thinking about what you're asking people to do. And then when you do commandeer chunks of their time as a group, as either a PLC or faculty meetings for that matter, be very sensitive and conscious of making sure that it's a meaningful experience and it's not a waste of people's time. You and I both know you got plenty of stuff to do without some principal or assistant principal forcing you to go through a forced march that you view as meaningless or not helpful. Katie, on that topic, Katie shared in her response to the discussion forum prompt about servant leadership. She shared, if you haven't read it yet, please go read it. Katie shared a beautiful story of servant leadership with us, and it reminded me of one of my own mentors that actually was the first principal that hired me. I've had so many mentors, and still, even though I'm an old fart, I still have a lot of mentors. I was visiting with one of those on the phone this morning. But my mentors through the years have helped me avoid so many disasters and guided me away from stepping in big piles of poop that I was certainly headed toward. But I was sharing a story a number of years ago of a mentor similar to the one Katie was talking about. Actually, I was visiting with a colleague about 30 years ago about the powerful mentorship and servant leadership component of Jerry, my first principal. And as I was sharing how much Jerry meant to me to this colleague of mine, the colleague just looked at me and he said, did you ever let Jerry know what he meant to you? And it caused me to pause, and because I hadn't. I had taken advantage of Jerry's mentorship and his leadership and his servant orientation, and I'd never gone to the trouble to let him know. So I sat down and wrote him a letter by hand. This was 30 years ago. This was before I had word processing, so I wrote it by hand. And I sent him that letter to let him know not only how much I appreciated, but I was specific about what I'd learned from him that he had helped me with. Some 25 years after I sent that letter to him, I saw Jerry at a funeral. And after the service, we were standing around the gravesite of the friend that we had lost. And Jerry, he looked at me and his eyes got misty, and he said, "Nelson, I want you to know that the letter you wrote to me 25 years ago was so meaningful." He said, of the teachers and coaches I worked with through the years, there's only two of you that have gone to the trouble to let me know what I meant to them. And he said, I've cherished those two letters and I have them still. And so I want to say that to you all to let you know that's a good idea, to let the people know that have touched you and helped you. Sometimes they do it, and almost always they do it with a servant's heart, with no expectation of return or reward. But it's a great practice. By the way, we buried Jerry last year, but I continue to owe Jerry a debt I can never repay. And my way of trying to do that is to continue to serve folks like yourself, either until I run out of gas or I become convinced that I'm no longer helpful to you. I bet you got some of those kind of mentors in your life. Thanks, Katie, for reminding me of that. Appreciate it. A few of you have commented that when I've asked you in the learning task, what would you do? What 2 steps would you take to try to address the problems or rectify things? A few of you have mentioned the issue of common planning time, and it's a great and powerful tool. Please understand that it's far easier said than done. well, we won't have time in this course, and I don't guess even in any of the courses that I teach, to have a conversation about how to go about master scheduling. But master scheduling is, there's a lot of technical and tricky and scientific stuff to it, but it's also very much like an occult art that has to be approached just like your PELCs, with the interest of the students first, or it's best approached that way. But the common planning time issue is a powerful one. It's a great idea. Some of you work on campuses where the principal and or the scheduling team have made a way for you to have some common planning time. On that topic, and by the way, it's a lot much easier said than done, but on that topic, on the issue of PLCs, Dufour is very emphatic about this, and I can tell you from experience how important it is. As you think about PLCs and you think about the work that you accomplish in those PLCs, you find ways to build that time into the work day. If you ask people to show up at 7 in the morning or stay until 6 or 7 in the evening to do that kind of work, you'll never be able to achieve, you might get it done for a short window of time, but it'll never be sustainable. And it'll never be consistent. You have to build the PLC work into the school day somehow, some way, even if you do it during your lunchtime on your own. If you're a principal, obviously you can't commandeer the lunchtime of others, but teachers can certainly assemble as they wish during their lunch and visit with who they want to. Another word that I see keep continually popping up in your conversations and your responses is the issue of empowerment. And it's key. Empowerment is key for transformative leadership. Give people the authority to act. And it gets back to the issue of trust. And I think I've mentioned this to you all before, but trust is the precursor of followership. And the things that you can do that fosters trust or between colleagues, and also in particular causes people to trust you, makes them much more willing to engage in the things that you ask them to engage in, and to pursue the kinds of goals that you propose. And bottom line is this: trust people until they give you some substantive reason not to, and give them authority to act. And when they do act on that authority, do all you can not to undercut them. If they've acted in ways that are legal and according to policy and in accordance to the guidance and the directions that you've given, don't undercut them. Even if they make a decision that may not be exactly the decision that you would have made. The powerful question prompt that I give you all in the learning tasks is designed to help you to move to that leadership perspective. And questioning is a whole skill in itself, and there's some great books that I could recommend to you about questioning. In fact, Becoming a Better Questioner resided on my personal growth plan for about 4 years running. And yeah, I have a personal growth plan. Now I'm about 15 years into that practice, and it's been a good one. If you want to see my current one, you can go to my website. But being powerful questioners can give us the ability, with intelligent people that we work with, a powerful question can generate some very rich discourse. A trivial question, or a question that's meant to evade, or a question that's meant to divert attention, will cost you. So be careful in the questions that you ask, and just from a technical perspective, never ask people yes or no questions. Don't let them get off that easily especially if you're trying to have student assessment data. Let's talk about that briefly, because that has been a prominent piece of the conversation that you all have been engaged in with regard to the PLCs, because especially grade level or departmental PLCs are almost exclusively focused on the student data. as they should be. It has come up, and many of you are very familiar with the conversation about formative data versus summative data. Dr. Doug Reeves, and I'll be introducing Dr. Reeves to you in subsequent weeks, if you're not already aware of him, a great writer, a great thinker in our profession. But he likens formative assessments to a physical that you would get with your physician, in which your health markers are being checked. And he likens summative assessments to an autopsy. After you're dead, they cut you open and see how healthy you were. Very great analogy, I think, as you think about when you're in your PLC work, what you decide to look at. As we talked about last week, we got more data than we can ever digest carefully. So one of the key pieces for you and me as leaders of PLCs is to help guide the team to spend our precious and valuable time only on the data that's going to have the most meaningful impact for our students. Anytime you decide how to direct your attention for a particular piece of time, then you're also making a decision of the things that you're going to ignore during that piece of time. And this has been part of the conversation I've seen in your chatter in the discussion forum is, and some of you have worked with people like this who are masters of diversion and trying to chase rabbits and get out in the weeds with conversations and engage in stuff that's really not very helpful and certainly not focused on your primary goals. The Dr. Ingvarsson interview, he asserts, and this seemed to resonate with a few of you, Dr. Ingvarsson asserts that student well-being must be a focal area of the PLCs, and I couldn't agree more. But I want to shift your focus one more time, and not just thinking about the students, but the well-being of the adults that you work with. As the leader of a campus or the leader of a school district, you are the person that is going to be fundamentally responsible for the health and well-being of that campus or that district. And when you're talking about that campus or that district, you're talking about the people on that campus or in that district. So I think Ingvarsson's right on the money. We have to be thoughtful about the well-being. And when I'm talking about well-being, I'm talking about emotional and physical and intellectual well-being of the people that we work with. That kind of cuts back to the leadership thing. I know I'm rattling. I'll shut up soon, I promise. On the make it stick prompt that I give you with your PLC team, I ask you in the learning task, what are you going to do to make it stick? I'm trying to push your thinking to how to effectively pull others toward those common goals, not push them. The harder you push, the more scattered it'll be. So if you and I can pull people toward the common goals, we'll be much more successful. Execution, comment about execution, principals and assistant principals. And as you think about becoming a campus principal or becoming an assistant principal, PLC work is hugely important for you and I, especially in accomplishing the campus goals that we have. I've seen so many principals and so many assistant principals demand that PLC work happen, but not be a participant in it. And I can tell you now, if you do not actively participate in that as the administrators or the leaders of the campus, it's not going to happen with fidelity. You don't necessarily have to be the leader of a PLC, for instance, if it's a science department in a middle school. But if you're the assistant principal that supervises the science department, you need to be present in those PLC meetings and you need to be a contributing member to those conversations. You will do yourself and the campus no good to demand that the meetings take place, demand that minutes be taken, and demand that minutes be sent to your email address. You cannot exercise that kind of leadership from afar. Um, Let me go here. The shift in the PLC in our metaphors. We're shifting this week, obviously, in week 2 to serve the servant leader, PLC leader as servant. There's some very interesting content that I'm putting in front of you there this week. And as you already can tell, I like to read and I like to think beyond just the realm of education. I think there's much to be learned from different sorts of professional genres that we can apply to our work. But the issue of servant leadership, you've been exposed to Robert Greenleaf in the first document this week. Another writer, a couple of writers, Dr. Tom Sergiovanni from Trinity University in San Antonio has written a lot of very nice stuff in relation to servant leadership. And Peter Block, who you're being exposed to in the interview this week, in the podcast interview, is a very profound thinker in terms of servant leadership and stewardship and the development of community. And the works of Dr. John Maxwell. He's a preacher. If you don't hold that against him, he's really a pretty prolific writer on the topic of leadership, and all of his works that I've read have been excellent. Perhaps the most prolific researcher on the topic of leadership, because the word transformational leadership came up in the conversations and some of the content I fed you, and also some of your back and forth in the course stuff. The transformational leadership is a word that really gained traction as a result of the studies, the leadership studies of Dr. Bernard Bass. And his life, professional life, was mostly in the 70s, 80s, 90s. But he is probably the most prolific researcher on the topic of leadership, not just prolific writer, but empirical research. And Dr. Bass really has a model of leadership that a theory of leadership, if you will, to steal from Dr. Christensen's words, that is twofold. Dr. Bass says that leaders function in one of two realms, and sometimes that they toggle back and forth. But one of them he calls transactional, where you try to gain what you want from your followers, either by teasing them with rewards or by threatening them with punishment of some kind. And because it's a transaction. If you do what I want you to do, you're either going to get this reward or you're going to be punished if you don't. But the more powerful mode, if you will, of leadership, Dr. Bass says, is transformational. And that cuts to those conversations that I've been having with you about where you pull, you collaborate with the folks that you're working with, you gain trust from them, and through many conversations, many interactions, you gain the trust of folks, and then when you start having the conversations about where are we going and how are we going to get there, they're much more likely to join in with you and help you craft a vision and articulate important goals toward that vision, but then also actually take the action steps that are necessary to follow. I've decided I'm going to offer you each week when I talk to you a few books for recommendation. And I know you all have full-time jobs. I know you have families. I know you have extracurricular activities. I know you're part of either social or faith groups that you have responsibility. I get it. I know. At someday though, you're not going to be in graduate school, and your learning will need to continue. So I'm going to try to offer to you each week a few books that have been powerful in shaping my thinking. And I promise you, I'm not going to recommend a book to you that I cannot recommend wholeheartedly. I've kind of touched on some of these, but I'll say them for you again in case you're developing a list for your professional or personal library. One of them is The Speed of Trust by Stephen M. Covey. He's the son of the famous Stephen Covey. an excellent work on accomplishing organizational goals as a result of trust. And he talks quite a bit about the price we pay when trust does not exist. And I've seen in some of your discussion forums, some of you commented on working on dysfunctional or toxic teams, and that's almost always the result of a lack of trust. The copyright on that is 2006, by the way. The power of pull, you've heard me use the phraseology pull people. The Power of Pull by Hagel, Brown, and Davison was written in 2010. One of the best books I've read in the last 5 years. And they talk at great length about the effectiveness of leadership that works from a pull and an invitational and inclusive perspective as opposed to the push. Or in Bernard Bass terms, the transformational versus the transaction. Another book that I think you'll find very helpful, and it's, in fact, my wife and I, it's just become almost part of our daily conversation, is The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, copyrights 2012. And Duhigg does a very nice job of discussing how our habits define us. In fact, I've probably given some of you that feedback in the grading. Our habits define us as individuals. Our habits define us as PLC teams. Our habits define us as professional teams. Our habits define us as parents and as teachers. Duhigg not only talks about the importance of the habits, but he talks about some very concrete steps that we can use to change some habits, which is really an interesting conversation. Creating Magic, written by a former vice president of Disney, a guy named Lee Cockrell, copyrights 2008. It's one of the best books I've read in many years about empowering the people on your team to act. And I mentioned this in comments earlier. When we trust the people and we empower that work around us, and we empower them to do the work, empower them to act, and begin embedding that into the culture of the organization, we can accomplish a lot more. Finally, not finally, stewardship. You're gonna listen to Peter Block talk on the podcast interview this week if you haven't already. One of the most influential books I've read in the last 20 years is titled Stewardship: Choosing Service Over Self-Interest by Peter Block. Powerful work. And as you can tell on the podcast, he's really very masterful, much more masterful than I am in his usage of words. And finally, The Eighth Habit by Stephen Covey. It's a great book. He builds off of the book he got famous writing, which was The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. But The Eighth Habit, he extends, he builds on those first 7 habits. Some of you have probably been exposed to that thinking. But the 8th habit that Covey discovered, or that he felt like was worth sharing with his audience, was finding your own voice and helping other people find theirs. Great work. I can highly recommend it to you. Okay, I'm going to, man, I've been just jabbering here for over 30 minutes. I need to shut up. And I'm going to turn my notes off and open my picture up to you. And couple of comments I see already in the chat box, but the floor is open. If you got questions for me about the course, about the content, you're free to make comments about the course or the content. Or if you want to put questions in the chat box, fire away. I belong to you now. Or problems of practice. I got scars resulting from almost every kind of problem you can imagine at school.
So I do have one question for you. The leadership standards that you sent to us, is there somewhere that we can find more information to help us break that down and kind of look at it at a better scope of what each standard is referencing to?
Those standards are, we think of them in terms of the national standards. And the version that you're seeing is actually the most recent version of that. They used to be called the ISLIC standards, but now they're the ELCC standards, the Educational Leadership Constituency Council. which is this big think tank of school leaders and college professors like myself that have coordinated and engaged upon this process of trying to decide what are the dimensions of school leadership that we should focus our attention on as we're trying to develop people to assume those roles. You see the 2018 version of that, ELCC. So if you do a Google search for that, it's gonna jump you to that organization. Most states have their own set of standards for school leadership, but almost all of them are cut very closely directly to those ELCC standards. And different kinds of organizations take on, they embody blue ribbon panels to go through the same conversation. But Dana, if you Google that, it's going to take you right to those. And again, and this has been part of our conversation, particularly after some of you watched Dr. Christensen's video. But let me hit the pause button here on that video. I trust that you know that I did not ask you to watch that video out of a motive of proselytizing, because it's not. Even though Dr. Christensen's clearly a spiritual person and a religious man, actually he's Latter-day Saint. I'm not. And actually Margaret Wheatley's Buddhist. I'm not. I'm not trying to promote one faith system or another, but the ideas that those two people put in front of you, I think, are extremely powerful. But those, back to my point, Dana, is this: those standards. It's almost any time we try to take a concept and well, to use Christensen's terms, disaggregate it into parts and pieces. It's a human fabrication. It's an artificial attempt to simplify a very complex process. We have to think of, just like we have to think of our human body as a holistic, integrated, functioning set of systems and processes that are ongoing all the time. For instance, none of us would function very well. Well, I suspect some of you have had diarrhea before. You know, that's a malady of your digestive system. But when you got it, a lot more than your digestive system is negatively impacted, correct? So so when we take leadership in the ELCC standards, it breaks it into those 7 categories. And there are a lot of other really very nice versions of standards for school leadership. One of my favorite is by Dr. Kim Marshall. But it just gives us a way to try to connect dots of the work we're doing and how does it fit in the big picture? How does it fit in the big picture? And that, on that topic, it reminds me of one of the questions that I always ask coaches and athletic directors when I'm interviewing them for service is I ask them to tell me where athletics fits into the holistic school endeavor, the educational endeavor. It's kind of surprising how some of them can't even begin to have that conversation. Who wrote The Power of Pull? That's Kim, I think. Hagel, Brown, let me pull my notes back up. Hagel, Brown, and somebody, let's see. Hagel, Brown, and Davison. Hagel, Brown, and Davison. Other questions? Thanks for the question, Dana. I hope you don't feel like I dodged it, do you? Okay. Who was the name on the first book that I mentioned? In that list of books, the first name was Stephen M. Covey. Speed of Trust. Hey, we got a new student. Okay, I'm fixing to turn it off. I got another class to go to. Some of you do too, I guess. Bye. Have a good week, all.